I'm going to save you all a lot of aggravation. I don't use slides. First, I would like to thank everyone, those who organized the meeting, those who are giving presentations and posters, and others who have just come to participate. My warm thanks to all of you. I wanted to start off with a bit of history of auditory scene analysis. The acceptance of my research started off very badly. When I submitted to the Journal of Experimental Psychology my first studies on stream segregation and the inability of listeners to detect patterns that cut across streams, the reviewers simply didn't want to believe the results. They made me go back and test my equipment to make sure that the apparent streams were not being created by the loudspeakers continuing to ring after each tone had been turned off. Well, I did the tests and finally got the thing accepted. And since then, virtually every research paper that I've submitted has been criticized because I actually asked people to describe what they've heard. Even though they did so on a numerical scale and their responses were analyzed by statistical tests, the judgments were thought to be too subjective. Only a behavioristic methodology such as the accuracy of a judgment was acceptable, with one exception. If people's judgments about what they had heard were subjected to a heavy mathematical treatment, as in the multidimensional scaling studies of Roger Shepard, this made the research scientific, even though you had just asked them what they thought of things. So I've been very pleased at the way this unscientific auditory scene analysis has eventually been accepted and incorporated into fields as diverse as music theory and vertebrate biology. I want to organize my discussion today around a few questions, some of which have seen some important developments since my book on auditory scene analysis was published. I'm going to use the abbreviation ASA to refer to auditory scene analysis, just to save breath. The first question is, what is the relation? This follows very nicely from David's talk. What is the relation between ASA and music? And particularly, does ASA favor one musical style over another? We all know that the rapid alternation of a high tone with a low one leads to the perception of two streams of sound, a high stream and a low one. The study of ASA began with a consideration of this pattern of sound. Was that not entirely true, because Jay Dowling was doing something similar with melodies, showing a separation of melodies reduced their interference. But unfortunately, this alternation of high and low tones got tied up in everybody's mind with the idea of ASA, as to become almost synonymous with it. And this can lead to the view that ASA favors the formation of multiple streams, because after all, that's the phenomenon that became the basis of the research. So I want to consider the question of whether ASA actually does favor the perception of multiple streams or musical polyphony. I don't think that it does. I believe there's an initial bias towards hearing all incoming acoustic energy as derived from a single source. Only when evidence builds up that there's more than one source does auditory scene analysis begin to hear more than one stream of sound. So it's not that it favors the hearing of multiple sources. It's built to hear what's happening in the world, be that a single dominant source of sound or multiple sources. And it does not always break an auditory input into the maximum number of sounds. and would not always be a good thing for it to do. An organ stop, for example, may use one pipe that produces a pitch, others whose fundamentals are low harmonics of the first, and yet these are merged by the auditory system into a single sound, and gives us the chance to have nice organ sounds. ASA interprets the incoming sound as two or more streams only when certain parts of the sound are independent of the remainder. And that reminds me of Dan Ellis's independent components analysis, where correlations among the behavior of different sounds groups them as one, where lack of correlation groups them as separate sounds. And this independence can consist of either their harmonic relationships or other spectral relations, their spatial relations, or their behavior over time. So if things are doing asynchronous things, you know there's more than one. So ASA does not necessarily work so as to hear multiple sources, but to hear sources that have independent existences in the world. This is what happens in natural environments for which we were built. However, music is not a natural environment. It's an artifact created by people who want the sound to be heard in a particular way. Since they themselves can hear what they've created, they can, by trial and error or by traditional conventions, manipulate the acoustic properties so as to encourage the listener to hear the sound the way they want them to. So as David has implied, ASA in itself does not favor the practice of voice leading or any other practice. They just say that if you present a particular pattern of sound, there'll be a bias in favor of organizing it in a particular way. They don't say whether this way is good or bad, enjoyable or aversive. Composers and performers are the ones who decide which textures they want the listeners to hear. It's not always polyphony, it may be monophony or homophony or some other texture. In all cases, without exception, the ASA principles ought to be able to tell us why we hear it in that way. So it really doesn't matter about the number of voices. The principles should apply and tell you why you're hearing that many voices. For example, suppose at a certain point in a piece of music you want to get extreme monophony, where only a single melodic line is heard, even though several sound sources, possibly instruments, human voices, or synthetic sounds are present and have been heard individually up to that point. But now you want them all to be heard as one voice. The ASA principles imply the following. Each time there's a burst of sound, such as a note, all of the sources should start and end at precisely the same instant, plus or minus 10 milliseconds. There rises and falls in pitch and in intensity. Even the vibrato and tremolo within a single note should be exactly synchronized. The pitch relation among the simultaneous sounds should preferably be unisons or octaves, or at worst fifths. They should not be too far apart in frequency, and they should come from the same place in space. And this will produce a perception of a single musical voice. If that's what you want, then that's how to get it. It's not up to scientists like myself to tell artists what to create, but only to show how the perceptual results follow from the way in which the auditory system works. David's hedonic theory of delight in mastery of something difficult may tell us why polyphony is so common in music. As an aside, the genius of the great pianist Glenn Gould is that he makes polyphony easier to decipher, which make it accessible to a wider audience. Certainly makes it accessible to me. So that's question number one. Question number 2, is ASA innate? This is more or less equivalent to a musician's asking whether the principles are independent of a particular musical style or tradition. If ASA were innate, you should be able to detect it in newborn human infants. And one would think that infants should be innately equipped with the ability to partition their sensory input into the distinct sounds. This would kickstart the learning process, allowing babies to learn the properties of distinct auditory events and not just mishmashes due to the mixture of those events. ASA is difficult to study in infants by behavioral means because their range of responses is so limited. However, a team of, as Claude mentioned, a team of researchers led by István Winkler at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences studied the electrical activity in the brains of newborns 2 to 5 days of age, right after their birth, in response to sound patterns when the infants were in what he calls active sleep. The use of evoked potentials, electrical activity triggered by a particular class of sensory events, was pioneered by Claude Alain at the Rotman Research Institute in Toronto and Elise Sussman at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in Bronx, New York. And using a variation of a technique developed by Sussman, Winkler and his colleagues in Hungary, as Claude mentioned, were able to demonstrate that the newborns were dividing a sequence of sounds into separate streams, despite not being able to do anything about it. This early presence of ASA in human life suggests that the process is innate, although our old friend Richard Parncutt would say that it has been learned in the womb. And if ASA is innate in humans, one might expect it to occur in other animals. After all, they all live in the same world that we do, in which important sounds are mixed with others. If we believe that evolution tends to be incremental, we would expect our ancestors and our evolutionary cousins, such as fish or birds, to possess ASA capabilities that resemble our own to a greater or lesser degree. And there's been an increasing number of studies done on non-human animals, and the ability to segregate important sounds from others has been found in many species. For example, in mammals, they've found it in macaque monkeys, Japanese monkeys, cats, and bats. In birds, European starlings, owls, and penguins. In fish, they've only, as far as I know, goldfish. And in amphibians, they've used tree frogs. And some of these results have been obtained using sounds of importance in the life of these animals, such as the recorded calls of penguins played to their chicks. But others have used arbitrary patterns of sounds, training the animals to make a different response depending on whether these patterns did or didn't show a stream segregation. And these have shown that ASA in the tested animals, which were monkeys and starlings, respond to the same set of variables as it does in people. And these cross-species similarities support the idea that ASA is innate in humans. Okay. Now, question 3 is there a simple neural explanation for ASA? The ability to observe ASA in non-human animals has made it possible to record from single neurons in their brains. This has been done in the auditory cortex of monkeys at an early stage in neural processing of sound, and in the cochlear nucleus of guinea pigs, an even earlier stage in auditory processing. These two areas of the auditory system have yielded similar responses to an alternation of high and low tones. Some neurons respond more strongly to one of these tones, but also respond to the other. In other words, they respond to both. This is thought to underlie the hearing of a single stream, since no neurons respond exclusively to either the high or the low tones. Neural activity that is thought to underlie segregation is found when the tones are moved further apart in frequency, or are alternated more rapidly, or are presented for a longer period of time. All these manipulations increase stream segregation in human listeners by report. They also cause the neurons in the monkey and guinea pig brains to become more selective in their response. Some now responding only to the high tone, and some only to the low one. And according to the authors, this corresponds to hearing two streams. One is tempted to say that we've now found the neural explanation of stream segregation. However, to explain ASA, it's not sufficient to find a group of neurons whose activity correlates with stream segregation of high and low tones. Even with a simple stimulus of alternating tones, it's not just differences in frequency that can lead to segregation, but many other differences as well. For example, if you alternate complex tones, differences in their spectral content, their fundamental frequencies, their locations in space, and even their phase spectra can lead to stream segregation. However, a neuroscientist wedded to the idea that a stream is simply a set of active neurons could try to find single neurons that respond to each of these features and account for stream segregation in the same way as was done for frequency. Even if successful, this would not be the end of the road. ASA is a system. These cues don't work one at a time, but they collaborate and compete with one another. It's important to show how things work in natural environments where alternating pure tones are rarely found. And many redundant cues point to the structure of the auditory scene. In such situations, when one cue doesn't give useful information, others may work. And since cues are redundant, the perceptual allocation of sensory information to the correct sound source may still be correct. Examples. Sound travels around corners, but loses the cue for spatial layout as it does so. But it still has a lot of features that can be used. It still has independent sets of harmonic relations, which can be used to say there are two sounds, not one. Frequency subregions that may be behaving differently over time, and higher and lower parts of the spectrum may be starting and stopping asynchronously. So we have onset asynchronies and independent changes in frequencies and amplitudes, which go around corners. Therefore, explanation in terms of neural activity have to explain how competition and collaboration occur in perceptual grouping. So not only do you have to find the feature detectors and how they respond to speed and so forth, but you got to figure out how to get them all together. And there are other problems. Competition, if two high tones, a higher one and a lower one, happen to group together as members of the same stream, if some high tones are added near to the scene and very close to the high tone, and some other low tones close to the low tone in frequency, or in pitch, I should say, then A and B, then these two tones may very well find themselves in separate streams because of the competition of these other tones. And these are competitions entirely within the domain of pitch, and we've got pitch and we've got various kinds of timbre, and we've got space, and we've got, which can all compete with one another as well. And then there's the competition between sequential grouping, which is in music the melodic line, and perceptual fusion, which is harmonic relationships. A tone that might otherwise be fused with others that start and stop at the same time can be captured out of the fused set by being included in a sequential stream. Conversely, a sound that can be removed from a sequential sound can be removed from a sequential stream if it's fused with other simultaneous sounds, so that it just becomes part of a complex sound with its own distinct timbre and doesn't fit into the sequential stream anymore. My guess is that it's going to be much harder to understand the system architecture in the brain which allows this interaction of cues than to understand how individual features contribute to ASA. This may be where we have to turn, where I was hoping we would have to turn to the research in computational auditory scene analysis, CASA. In the work described by Dan Ellis, the creators of systems of artificial intelligence have to always embed helpful computations in a larger system so that they can work together, because otherwise you wouldn't get a result. And in engineering, you need to get a result. So they have to face the issue of how different cues and sources of information can collaborate and compete. But any system that aims to model the human auditory system successfully has to be what I call scalable. I'm not sure I'm using this word correctly, but I'm referring to an ability to work with a variable number of cues and knowledge sources, degrading gracefully as some are removed and getting stronger as new ones are added. It has to be able to work with a variable number of schemas, which is what I call pieces of acquired knowledge about specific types of acoustic signals. Schemas might include the probability of one type of speech sound following another, exploited in some of Dan Ellis's systems, the progression of musical features in a particular musical style, the characteristic sounds of a malfunctioning car engine. As new acoustic regularities are learned by the brain of the person or computer and packaged into new schemas, a scalable system must not be overwhelmed, but must provide a way for each new schema to collaborate in the formation of auditory streams or other structures, no matter how many schemas are added. Scalability in this sense is what the human brain is superb at, despite its massive database. Getting back to the topic of neural explanation of ASA, let me consider this question. This is a last on this point. What if a series of neural networks should someday be able to explain ASA, each network explaining a different perceptual phenomenon? Does this justify saying that ASA is nothing but the activity of these networks? There would still remain the question of why these networks exist in the first place. The nervous systems of animals, like every other aspect of their makeup, is subject to evolutionary pressures. The eye, for example, is not just a swiveling enclosure that has transparent light refracting surface at the front and a photosensitive surface at the back and some attached neurons. That misses the point. The eye is there to see with. Now, but a person might say, but isn't this a teleological explanation? Where the explanation of something is given in terms of its purpose. Yes, it is. And they say, aren't teleological explanations taboo in a science that deals in terms of causes and effects? Surely the purpose of an anatomical structure can't cause its structure. I would counter this argument by noting that the concept of evolution implies that certain features of living things are there because they helped creatures to survive. I would argue that this view brings teleological thinking back into the good graces of science. Biologists now talk all the time in terms of the purposes of the structures and properties of living things. The eye is for seeing, wings are for flying, and teeth are for ripping and chewing, just as they were in the old days before modern science. Now, I have one last question. I'm going to say one or two words more on this. Viewed in this way, the ASA networks, viewed in the teleological way, serve the purpose of dealing with a world in which the sound of a particular source is important for survival, but the sound pattern produced by accidental mixtures is not important. So a neural explanation of ASA does not eliminate the necessity of studying how ASA works in functional terms. Indeed, an understanding in functional terms guides our study of how the neurons implement the functions. Notice that function and purpose are not neurological concepts, yet they are the ideas that give meaning to the neural circuits. So these concepts, the ones that have guided my research, cannot be eliminated in favor of the neural ones. My final question is, why isn't there more study of the moving listener? I believe that in the case of computer models, the emphasis should be on robots rather than stationary listeners. In psychoacoustic experiments, the subject should be encouraged to make certain constrained types of motion. Researchers in this field may smack their foreheads and say they have enough trouble explaining ASA in stationary listeners without having to deal with the added complexity of head and body motions. My reply is that rather than making explanations of ASA harder, taking movement into account may make it easier. Head movement improves the cues for spatial locations, for example, eliminating front-back confusions, and hence improves the spatial separation of sound sources. It also permits distance to be more accurately estimated. And body movement, by moving the listener from one location to another, can sample the frequency content of signals better, because at specific locations inside enclosures could be affected by the results of reflection and interference of sound waves, such as a location-specific null in the intensity of a particular frequency components. So head and body movements are not nuisances which are to be eliminated in studies of auditory perception, but are instead a rich source of information. Animals are built to move around, and our perceptual systems must have evolved not only to deal with this motion as if it was a troublesome thing, but to take advantage of it. So this is the end of my set of questions for today, and I'm hoping that they will stimulate some discussion. Thank you.